Very good morning and welcome to this online policy briefing at EPC on Can the Coronavirus Crisis be a Catalyst for Climate Action? We are extremely delighted to have Diederik Samsom, Head of Cabinet to European Commission Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, who is responsible for the European Green Deal, to join us today. My name is Annika Hedberg. I'm the Head of the Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program. And we are looking forward to the discussion today. We're expecting close to 400 participants, so it will be very busy. And just to guide you through to some of the practicalities to make this discussion as efficient and smooth as possible. If you are interested to ask questions, and there are two ways for you to do that. After Diederik Samsom has spoken, I can give you opportunities to speak out. If you wish to ask a question or make a very short comment, click on the hand icon next to your name. And you can also ask written questions in the space provided, but please keep your questions short. It will be very difficult for me to read your questions if they turn into small essays. So please keep your questions short. And I'll try to give as many of you a chance to have your voice heard as possible. To turn to the discussion of today, the ongoing health crisis in a few months has really turned the world upside down. The efforts to contain the pandemic have led to enormous economic and societal impacts. We see that many industries, businesses are in enormous trouble. Value chains are disrupted, people are losing jobs. We can expect that there will be significant reduction of investments that can be made available from the private sector. This crisis is also having implications on public budgets. We're seeing unprecedented amounts of taxpayers' money being made available to rescue businesses. So the world is not as it was before. At the same time, some months ago, it still seems that the Green Deal, the climate and the wider sustainability crisis were at the top of our minds in Europe. And the reality is that even though the wider sustainability crisis is out of limelight at the moment, it has not disappeared. And it is very positive to see that there is a wide recognition across the EU that, first of all, sustainable growth can be a way out of the crisis. And in theory, many member states, and actually all of the member states, have stated their commitments to sustainable growth when planning for recovery from the corona crisis. And we see a lot of references being made to the Green Deal as our growth strategy out of the crisis. For many, we have seen that corona crisis has also increased the realization how much impact our normal activities actually have on climate and environment. And it is raising questions around the sustainability of our current economic model. We've also seen that people can be extremely important players in managing any crisis. And many are already discovering new ways of doing things and even drastically changing how they live, how we live and work, that could actually have positive longer-term impacts on climate. But as said, we're faced with enormous challenges. And in this context, it is a big question. How can we turn the COVID crisis into a catalyst for climate action and use it to accelerate efforts towards climate neutrality, as we have committed to do? With these words, very pleased and grateful that Diederik Samsom is joining us today, and happy to give the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annika, and welcome to all of you here, somewhere around out there on this screen. Yes, I was asked to talk about this subject of whether the corona crisis could act as a catalyst for climate action. And first of all, I would like to turn that question around. I think climate action can turn into a catalyst for recovering ourselves from this corona crisis. That should be our main goal. And as Annika already outlined, there's a lot of political and rhetoric and discussions in society on how to get out of this economic crisis that we are now getting into. And the Green Deal plays a big part in there. And that's heartwarming, but it's only rhetorics. In reality, we face an enormous challenge. As I'm starting to speak right now, Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni gives the economic forecast for this and next year to the world. The economic forecast that was just prepared and finished and is now published to see what we think, what the Commission thinks the prospects for the European economy are for this and for next year. And to summarize, we will be in territory that we've never been into in terms of economic slowdown, in terms of raise of unemployment, and in terms of the investment gap by the private sector and public deficits and debts. All figures that you've never seen. And we thought we were used to some dramatic figures going back to 2008 and 2009 in the financial crisis. Double that and you are in the corona crisis. So that's the situation we are in right now. How to get out of that? First of all, nobody exactly knows. Let's be honest to each other. Unknown territory is unknown for everyone. And if there's one out there saying, oh, I know exactly where we're going to and how to get out of that, well, good for you, but I don't think that's the reality. The reality is that we have to guide ourselves through this crisis for a while and then decide the best pathway up to a new economic reality. But in all those unknowns, we can prepare ourselves as good as we can. We can prepare ourselves for closing the investment gap, and the investment gap from the private sector needs to be closed with probably public money, because there's no other money available. And we need to prepare ourselves for a recovery that doesn't take us back into the old, but brings us forward into the new world. And that's where the Green Deal is coming in. You might remember that in December, in a completely different world, we presented the Green Deal as a growth strategy. It was not presented as an environmental strategy, and it got some criticism for that from the environmental world, and saying, well, why present this as a growth strategy? And that was a political choice to do it that way. And well, with hindsight, I'm happy we did, because we presented it at that time as a new model for Europe, as a Marshall Plan for Europe. And there's an outcry now for a Marshall Plan, which could be the Green Deal. All the investments, all the plans, all the proposals in there are delivering growth, new growth to a continent, and a continent in dire need of new growth at the moment, and that will only get worse in the coming months. But we can't just continue as if nothing happened. We need to reprioritize our work. We need to rebalance our work. We need to rethink some of the Green Deal work. Rethinking means, for instance, setting everything up front which delivers jobs and growth immediately, because that's what people will be craving for in the coming months and years to come. New jobs where old jobs are getting lost at incredible pace right now, and new growth where there's now economic shrinking at an incredible pace. So let me give you one example of new prioritization within the Green Deal. That's the renovation wave. Refitting 200 million homes and all the public and other buildings around it towards a level that they don't consume that much energy. They actually can produce energy, get a much more sustainable world. That will deliver enormous amount of jobs, because it's SME work to refit a home or an office building. It will provide new growth, and it will provide lower energy bills to the people living in those houses, and they could use a lower energy bill with the purchasing power that is also going to get lost in the coming in this enormous crisis. That's only one example. Let me give you one other example. If you want to move forward into a new energy system, which we were already envisaging, we could use these circumstances where loads of public money are going to be needed into the energy system to jump forward towards a hydrogen economy. So large investments into hydrogen production, transportation, and deployment, the use of it, might be done quicker than we actually anticipated. A third example, transport. We know that the automobile industry in Europe is a pillar under our economy. Whatever you think of it, we are a car economy. If people stop buying cars, a big part of the economy is in big trouble. And I can tell you, people did stop buying cars in the last month, and they will keep doing so for the next few months, and it will only pick up later on. So we need a plan for the automobile industry. We could save them, we will save them, we will save those hundreds of thousands of jobs that are now on the line, but we might also make a deal with them saying, okay, if we are investing public money into automobile companies, why not speed up your investments into the electrical drivetrain, into the electrical car future? And at the same time, we might speed up our investments for charging infrastructure so that those electrical cars have something to drive on. That's only a third example. There's many more of that, but this is the way we are now currently rethinking our work, re-strategizing our Green Deal, and then in due time, we will come out with a recovery plan as announced by President von der Leyen, as asked for by the European Council. Somewhere in the next months, the European Commission needs to show that we are ready for a new future. And then we need to find the money for that. We need to have all those heavy political discussions with member states and others and other stakeholders. But to end on a positive note, I think we have the opportunity at hand. We have these strategies at hand. We might have the political will at hand to recover from this incredible crisis in a way that brings us further to the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this overview. It's unprecedented times, and it's the pressure on you as well. It's enormous on trying to see where we can take the work. In many ways, obviously, it's positive that the Green Deal is out there, because now, as we are more desperate than ever for answers and ideas on how to get our economy on a greener track, and in many ways, the Green Deal, in principle, should provide that basis. We do see that across the EU, we have seen a lot of positive signals, comments that Green Deal indeed should form the basis for our growth strategy. I'll be happy to get your thoughts on how do you see the state of play and across the EU, to what extent can we really see the commitment across the member state that Green Deal really should form the basis for our growth strategy?
Well, as you might have noticed, and I already flagged it, the political rhetorics are fine. I'm actually, I feel supported by many letters from ministers, also heads of state, by many declarations from people like President Macron and others saying, okay, we need a green recovery out of this crisis. So the political rhetorics are there, but I'm not naive. The reality is much more difficult. And we find ourselves, as I said, in a system where jobs are getting lost by tens of thousands a day. And there's nothing more logical than a knee-jerk reflex that once we can go about with our lives again, we pick up the pieces where we left them. We start driving, flying, and operating like we always drove and fled and operated. That's the normal human reaction. You want to get back to business as soon as you can. That's for a human being, and that's for a company, and that's actually also for a government. And in order to turn that into not just picking up the pieces where you left them, but picking up new pieces and bring them forward, you need a little more time. You need a little more contemplation and organization, and you might also need a little more money than you were anticipating. And all three are pretty scarce in a post-crisis era. So the political will is one, and I think it's there to a certain extent, and as I said, to an optimistic amount of it. but we need to be vigilant and we need to concentrate ourselves. If we can't deliver plans in terms of a Green Deal recovery that do not deliver jobs and growth, forget about it. Because we need, and so that's our challenge now. We need to combine the several demands from society. Yes, there's a demand for a green recovery. That's great. But there's also a demand for jobs, growth, and getting back into business. And we need to combine that. If we are able to do so, and I'm happy to work with every stakeholder that has ideas and plans and suggestions for that, if we are able to combine that, we can do what we want.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We already have some questions, so I'll mention the name of the person. I will unmute you, and please, if you can introduce yourself when you ask your question, that would be great. Heather Crabb, you'll be the first one.
Hello, this is Heather Graby from Open Society. Thanks very much for this great overview. I have a question about how to sustain public support for the Green Deal in the member states. Currently, there's a good alignment within the Commission and there's support from the European Parliament, but there's still a big problem that much of the money for public bailouts is in the hands of the member states. And I'd like to know from you how you think that the Commission can influence the conditions put on the use of that public money, where basically the European taxpayer is subsidizing the private sector. Is it possible, for example, to put in, to have some kind of agreement on universal conditions that companies receiving public money have to have a zero carbon transition plan, which they present both to their government funder and of course also to their shareholders if they're a public company, or to their board. That would be a very strong signal to private capital that they need to be investing in zero carbon transition. But I wonder what your views are on how feasible that is for the Commission to do that through single market regulation and of course use of public money at EU level. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If I may, I'll take two other questions that we have. Kees Boonman.
Kees, you are muted. You just have to unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Kees Boonman, we'll give you a chance to ask a question. We will, we will come back to you later if you still have a question. Then we have a question from Malcolm Harbour. We will unmute you now.
Yes, thank you, Annika. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, Malcolm Harbour. I'm a senior advisor to EPC and also a former chairman of IMCO. I agree very much with what you said earlier about the rethinking of public engagement and public investment in solving problems that COVID has revealed. I am particularly interested and have been advocating for years the use of public procurement as a better instrument. And what has really interested me about the COVID crisis is that public authorities finally have discovered the power of investing in innovative solutions and deploying public procurement more effectively. And we also need the standards to go along with it. So I just want to know whether you agree with that. And if so, I and others, and EPC in particular, will be delighted to help move that movement forward. And indeed, I have a seminar that I'm organising in the UK on Tuesday next week. So I thank you for letting me promote that also.
And we would also have a question from Mets Buskiar Rasmussen. We will unmute you now.
Hi, this is Diederik Johnson from Greater Copenhagen EU office. I think there was a mix-up with the names, but anyway, so my question relates to the ongoing need for private investment to be challenged or to be channeled to sort of serve the policy objectives of the Green Deal, which is needed on a great scale. So I'm wondering how you will, in this post-crisis world, will work to further incentivize or re-incentivize private investments towards the Green Deal policy objectives?
Thank you very much for these questions. And indeed, the last question relates also, obviously, for example, when we're talking about the energy transition and renewables, where in principle, the hope has been that we would have a lot of private money being made available. And what is going to happen now when the private investment is going down? How can we ensure this, this transition, as an example? But yes, please, Mr. Samsom.
Yes, well, the first question was is an imminent one, because we at the moment we are watching bailouts happening at a large scale, or at least recapitalizations or liquidity supply to companies, which is the first phase of what might be bailouts in a later phase. And we see that in the aviation industry and in the car industry already, those discussions happening. Actually, I'm glad to see that in all member states, the discussion on conditionality of that money is already started, which is a discussion which was a sort of a taboo, at least on the under economists in the former years. You shouldn't put conditions to liquidity supply and not to recapitalization, because that would hamper the recovery of such a company. And now it's the discussion, at least, is started in the other direction, saying, well, it might also help the recovery in a more sustainable way, both green but also in an economic sustainable way. And you're right that the Commission is watching this with more than just interest. We are the guardians of the single market, and we can't let it happen that, for instance, in one country there's enormous amounts of money spent on keeping companies afloat, and in other countries which have less fiscal space, that's not happening. Or in one country, there's green conditions attached to some of the bailouts and the recapitalizations, and in other countries, it's not. That's a threat to the single market, and in the latter example, it's also a threat to the environment. So we need to be vigilant on that, and our single market rules are going to be used for that. And Margrethe Vestager is at the moment delivering amendments to the recapitalization directives and the rules, and also keeping a close eye on this. The other way we can intervene and we could help this issue is indeed, as you said, using EU money for this. EU money to bail out or to help companies in trouble, and also that enables us to have pan-European conditions, pan-European bailouts under the same conditions and the same rules, which is good for the single market and good for the environment. We're not there yet. Those are the discussions that are currently ongoing in the context of the new MFF, the revised MFF that might help with the recovery, or that will be an instrument in the recovery, might be the instrument of the recovery. That's a, well, as you know, contagious discussion between a Commission who has to propose it, but also Member States and Parliament who have to agree with it. Exciting weeks ahead of us. The public procurement is another issue that we could use, indeed, much more stronger than we are doing it right now. Within the Green Deal, we already had plans to basically compile more public procurements within Europe to create bigger amounts, for instance, for electrical buses, where we see that small communities are buying 5 buses and another one is buying 6, and then there's another one buying 12, and we buy them in China, and well, nothing's really happening on a European industry. So we were already having ideas and plans, and we are now putting them into practice much more, or we want to put them into practice with more speed, because it's needed right now. It could help the recovery, and it could also help greening these urban city mobility, which is one very big question mark after the corona crisis. What's happening to public transport or to mobility in cities? Is everybody jumping into a car because that's the safest way to transport yourself without being infected by somebody else, or are we all going to get on a bike? Or are we developing new ways of public transport that are corona resistant in one way or another? Those questions are at the moment addressed within the Commission, and I'm sure within loads of other parts of the European society. How to muster private investments, the last question. Before Corona happened, we already launched the European Green Deal investment plan, which was exactly the formula of driving private money into green investments by using some public money. If the public money takes away the first risk, private money might follow soon. And that same formula applies, but now with another balance. I think there's more public needed to drive in private investments, but there's still a lot of private money out there looking for good investments. And what we've seen now, we expect, for instance, investments in clean technology, clean energy projects to be, just as the rest of the economy, severely affected by the Corona crisis, going back with 15 to 20%. And obviously we want to fill that gap. We might need a bit more public money to do so, but then private money might come in too. So it's the same formula that we had before Corona, but now the parameters have changed, and maybe quite dramatically. And dependent on how much they've changed, we need much more public investment to make it happen.
Thank you very much. And maybe just to build on that, it's obviously it's extremely important that this time in space we do provide the signal for the private sector to know where to invest and where to get the best returns also in the future. And that's where the policy framework, as well as obviously the public money, can provide a very important signal on the direction of travel. We have had some written questions, so I'll speak on some of these topics. First of all, there is a question and questions around the follow-up initiatives to the Green Deal, including some of the proposals for regulations. Many of these would request or would aim to increase compliance of private sector of industries to the Green Deal. So what is the process? Are there some delays expected? What are the delays expected? And also, what in your mind do you think are the most important follow-up initiatives that should not be postponed and that should really need to be pushed forward at the moment? And just picking on some of the initiatives that we know that we're waiting, the European Climate Pact, and there's an offshore renewable energy initiative, farm to fork strategies, etc. So happy to hear your thoughts on that. Another written question we had was just to know more about how to speed up the jump to the hydrogen economy and when, for example, the Clean Hydrogen Alliance could be launched to do that. And then a question also around the role of the local and regional authorities in these efforts. So maybe we can take these written questions and then I'll come back to the audience for oral questions.
All right, well, thank you very much for those. Yeah, well, to summarize, we're not going to delay anything. Obviously, there might be some practical delays because public consultation is pretty difficult in these circumstances. And also within the Commission, we now 27,000 people working from home. So you have some practical, we had some practical glitches to solve and to continue working. So that might have resulted in a delay of a few weeks of some of the strategies. But for instance, farm to fork and biodiversity strategy, we still expect that in the second half of this month. So not a substantial delay whatsoever, and they are important. They are important because it's not only about energy and climate where we're talking about. The Corona crisis has amplified the necessity of living in harmony with our surroundings, with nature. And that's exactly what the biodiversity strategy will try to do, enhance that harmony between human beings and nature and stop the loss of biodiversity and increase our natural capital. And all are needed, that were needed before Corona and are even more needed right now. In other terms, I mean, what are strategies that are pretty important in terms of the recovery from the crisis? Well, I already outlined the renovation wave, for instance, but also this energy sector integration. which has a lot to do with hydrogen, obviously. We were planning to come out with that soon, and we are still planning to come out with that soon, because in there we lay out the investments needed for the future, which will create a certainty also for private parties, private companies that then know where to invest in, what's the direction that the European community wants to go with its energy system. And obviously we have to break the barrier between electricity and gas. It is one energy system in which hydrogen will play a key role as an enabler of moving from electrons to molecules, from electricity to gas and back, and also to store energy in the intermittent supply that solar and wind are going to give us much more than we had. So those are strategies that are still on the table. Some will even move a bit forward. The Commission will come out with a revised Commission work program. That's our catalog of things that that's our calendar for the next year. That had to be revised due to Corona. Obviously, it will come out very soon. And there you will find all the initiatives that we already outlined in the Green Deal. You will find it back on our calendar. On hydrogen, indeed, one of the ideas already announced in the industrial strategy just before Corona hit us was the launch of the Hydrogen Alliance, which is sort of the brother or the sister of the Battery Alliance, which was pretty successful. It's still ongoing, and we need something similar with hydrogen. We need a stakeholder platform where several parts of the value chain within hydrogen can find each other, can talk to governments, can talk to us, and we can talk to them, and we can make the best strategic planning that we can. Obviously, such a platform is now needed more than ever. So I don't expect any delay in the announcement of that too. The role of regional and local authorities, well, that was already pretty prominent. We already talked about public procurement, but also in terms of the renovation wave. I mean, the last thing that a family in Slovakia is going to do when it wants to insulate its home is to call Brussels. I don't think that will come into mind. It will be calling the local bank, the local SME, the local construction company, and maybe also the local community if there's an incentive scheme for such an insulation plan. We can back those regional and local authorities up, but they have to do much of the work, if not all of the work. So a few months ago, I went to the Committee of the Regions, telling them that actually we were utterly dependent on their activities and their initiatives to make the Green Deal happen. The big strategies that we launch here in the Berlaymont building and in the press room of this Brussels building, those big strategies will only land somewhere in a community, and that's where they make a difference, not on paper. We are well aware of the fact that local and regional authorities are key in this transition, and they might also be, or they will also be very affected also in terms of their balance sheets, their budgets by the Corona crisis. So if we have a recovery plan from the Commission, we will have to take that into account, that money does flow in the end also to lower public governments than just the national government.
Very good, and thank you very much. We have some other questions. We'll unmute you. Peter Bocek, the floor is yours.
Yes, hello. Hi, Annika. Hi, Diederik. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. When the new commission came in, Ursula von der Leyen had her man on the moon moment, as we recall, and a lot of legislative processes were kicked off, one of which is the climate law, as we all know, based on work the Commission did back in 2018, I believe, looking at possible strategies, pathways towards 2050 to a low carbon future or carbon neutral future even. And the question I have is, well, now the legislative process is in full speed. We are in the first reading. And still we refer to impact assessment work that was done well before the crisis that we are now experiencing. Also, we are talking now about pathways and the transition transformation that is expected by 2030, by 2040. How does the crisis now impact the impact assessment work or the assumptions made before the crisis? Because we are now in a different world. We all have to understand. And I would like to see, you say you are re-strategizing the Green Deal, but a lot of the what we are now talking also in the Parliament and in the Council is indeed is not re-strategized. It's the stuff that has been done before. So how is this adapted, or is there a mechanism to be more flexible and not to base things on assumptions that might be outdated? Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a question from Matthijs and Schiffers. The floor is yours.
Hi, Mr. Samsom. I have two questions. One is also regarding the relation between public money and private money. You said we need more public money now to fill the investment gap. Do you have a percentage in mind? Originally, the plan was, I think, to have an investment available of 1 trillion over the next decade. I don't know what the original division was between public money and private money and where it is shifting towards now. And the second question is related to that and has to do with the multi-financial framework and the role of the Dutch government in the discussions around this. Do you have a message for the government of your own country?
And as a last question for this round, we have a question from Matti Mannonen. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the excellent presentation and for the opportunity to participate in this. I have actually two questions. The first one was about the action that has to reach the local authorities. I've heard that the cohesion funds will be used earlier than or more than originally planned. Will they be used in accelerating the Green Deal, and how do the local authorities or the countries think about it? And then the second question is about this digital leap that the companies and actually the whole society has been forced to do during the crisis. How do you intend to accelerate the digitalization of Europe and the use of data in advancing the Green Deal? Thanks.
And if I may just build on the last question. So indeed, what we've seen is that the member states themselves, they stated their commitment to sustainable growth and indicated that what we need to do is we need to address the dual challenge of green transition and digital transformation in our recovery strategies. So very interesting to hear also what are the possibilities you see with digitalization actually being an enabler for the green transition. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much. A few very different questions. Let me address them one by one. The climate law and the assessment, the impact assessment that is underway to decide or to inform us about the to inform the political decision whether to go to -50 or -55 in 2030. So if the impact assessment would have to inform us about a target in 2022, everything would have been thrown into the dustbin now, because the world is completely different and will not have recovered completely in terms of the economy and also not in the emissions in 2022. But we do think, we still have reason to think that by 2030, which is a decade from now, we are recovered from this corona crash, and we are not back to normal, but we are back on the original scenarios that were envisaged. Obviously, we have to take into account the economic dip that is now occurring, so there will be different scenarios, but well, we can't anticipate any outcome of the impact assessment, but I do think we can still have confidence in the assessment that will come out in September, in informing us on whether to go for -50 or -55 in 2030. So that's not going to be impacted that much, we think. And you rightly said it looks like if we go on like nothing happened. For a part, that's because the Green Deal is about 3 decades, 30 years, and indeed, in 10 or even more, 15 years time, things will have normalized. Yeah, hopefully much earlier than that, by the way. But as I said, on the short term, using the Green Deal scenarios or the Green Deal initiatives as part of the recovery, we are reprioritizing our work, and hopefully we can be able to publish or to let you know what the reprioritization has led to very soon. The question about public money, the original plan, the European Green Deal investment plan, was talking about indeed mustering $1 trillion by using the budgets of the Commission, which was about 3 to 350 billion out of the existing MFF proposal. That was sort of the ratio before Corona. What the ratio will be after Corona, it's unclear yet. The first assessments are being done at the moment, and indeed there's numbers flying around about an investment gap of $1 trillion due to Corona, an investment gap that at least needs to be filled partly by public money. So that's where extra public money will come in, and that's also why the Commission is working on a revised MFF in order to address these challenges, including the investment gap. What the exact numbers are going to be, well, the first maybe the first sneak preview is given via the economic forecast, in which you can find some of those numbers in terms of debt deficit, but also investment gaps in the future. The answer will come hopefully sooner rather than later, and the answer will also address what kind of instruments within the revised MFF are suitable for channeling money towards a quick and green recovery, and the cohesion funds are obviously a candidate for that, but not the only one. For the digital transformation, it's what we like to call the twin transition needed for the future. Not only green, but also digital, and they actually, indeed, they interact. There's a lot of digitalization needed to enable the green transition in terms of industrial data, but also smart energy systems, etc. 5G, self-driving cars, etc. That's all digital transition in play. So what we said about the Green Deal, the green recovery, we're also talking about a digital recovery. It's now abundantly clear that broadband to every home in Europe, it has added value if you are stuck at home, either to school your kids or to join a meeting like this. So if people were not realizing how important it was, they do realize now, and we obviously hope it will speed up the much needed investments in parts of Europe to get the internet up and running. And that's only one part of the digital transition. So if we're talking about a recovery out of this crisis and the twin transition driving that recovery, it's both green and digital. Oh yeah, and there was one obviously ominous question about the Dutch government and its attitude. Well, we've all watched it on television, and so far my advice would be, and I've said that earlier publicly, my advice would be that the Dutch government has a serious word with itself, because on one hand, and I applaud them for that, they are one of the big promoters of a green recovery, the Green Deal as the driver of the economic recovery. And at the same time, they kind of one of the frugals, to put it mildly, in terms of providing the means for such a recovery. I think that well, disparity within the Dutch attitude has to be solved one way or another. I think it's the Dutch government itself that can best solve it.
Thank you very much. It doesn't look like we have other questions to be posed orally, so I'll pick up on some of the other written questions, and this is going to be quite a few. First of all, there's a question, why do we need to keep on focusing on growth? Should we not be focusing on well-being instead? And so that's obviously a big question. Also questions around circular economy and what role does it play in this, and also the follow-up to the circular economy action plan. On going to mobility, what role should there be for e-mobility investment? Another question relates to air pollution. Obviously, we have seen air pollution going down as a result of the efforts to contain the pandemic. What lessons should we take from here, and how can we ensure that the actually air we breathe in the future will also be cleaner? And obviously, this probably has implications also for the zero pollution strategy. And another important question obviously relates to the just transition. We will see that there will be enormous gaps between countries and regions as they try to address the economic consequences of the crisis, but also going ahead and ensuring the transition that we have been discussing before, that it needs to be fair. What are the tools at EU level to actually help to address some of these growing inequalities and problems that countries and regions will face when trying to address the issues? And finishing off with global context, just to keep in mind that obviously Europe does operate in a global environment. What we do see is that there is more and more emphasis into kind of nationalistic, my country first approaches across the world. We also do see that countries like China and US are pouring public money into rescuing their polluting industries. What role can the EU play in global climate action, and how can we also help others to see that there is potential, and we should actually try to accelerate efforts for green recovery also beyond the EU borders? So that's quite a few, sorry for that, but thank you for trying to respond as many of them as you can.
Let's see whether we can address them all in due time, which means 10 minutes. Let's see. Well-being instead of growth. Yeah, it's the philosophical question that always comes up in these times, and actually in every time. And I can admit I was an anti-growth once while working for Greenpeace and other environmental NGOs. But I must admit, we had our experiment with economic decline in the financial crisis, and it wasn't a success. Not in terms of well-being and not in terms of environment, because innovation stalled and people got unemployed. So I don't think an anti-growth agenda is the issue. I do think that growth has a size, but also a direction. And no matter the size, we should be able, as politicians and as a society, to take the direction into our own hands and steer it towards a greener and a sustainable future. And I think economic growth can be used for that. Also on a philosophical level, all of us arise every morning out of our bed having the ambition to do a bit better than yesterday. We all have the ambition to teach our kids something more, to do something ourselves a bit better than we did it yesterday. And 520 million Europeans getting out of bed every morning with the ambition to do a bit better than yesterday, that's growth. And what we need to do is to channel that growth into a sustainable future in the interest of the well-being of everybody. That's completely clear. On the circular economy, that's obviously one of the bigger nuts to crack in terms of our sustainability challenge. I've always compared it, if you look at the climate or the energy challenge, that's difficult. But we're somewhere on the way. If you look at the cost curves of solar panels and electrical vehicles, for the circular economy, we are way behind, and we need to catch up with that. And there's obviously huge investments possible and needed now. If I look at the waste industry, the waste sector in Europe, which is quite big, we don't like to talk about it a lot because it's dirty, but the waste industry is a big industry and it can improve itself and wants to improve itself. And maybe some of the programs in terms of economic recovery might be channeled there. You're talking about big money, you're talking about big recycling facilities, real recycling facilities that might help the circular economy a step forward. Mobility, well, I think I've addressed that a bit, not enough apparently, but indeed, when you're talking about speeding up the electric mobility, you're talking about charging infrastructure. I mean, every family in Europe needs to be able to drive around in an electrical car without having to worry about the next charging station being out of reach. So we need 1, 2, maybe 2.5 million extra charging stations on the highways alone. And that's where Europe might come in. I know a lot of charging points that are very profitable, that have an enormous business case. So I leave them to the private sector. But we need to steer it in a way that it's equally dispersed over Europe, also in rural areas, somewhere where you not or never earn your money back. And then that's where the government comes in. In air pollution, that's an interesting issue, because I think, and I heard President Macron say that after this crisis, people will not accept breathing dirty air anymore. They've now been accustomed to breathing clean air. And in cities, there's really miracles happening, especially for families with kids with asthma or other respiratory diseases. They all of a sudden are in heaven, well, apart from the corona misery that's also affecting them. But for them, this is a real progress. And what we've always said in the beginning is that clean air might be a bigger driver for change than climate change. People are not very motivated by the emission trading system. They are pretty motivated by clean air in their neighborhoods. So I do think that cities have a huge challenge here, also in well, getting back their mobility up to speed, as we discussed earlier. If everybody's jumping in a car again, we are far from home. If we manage to set out biking lanes and green areas and increase our public transport in a way that is corona-proof, then we make a step forward. And obviously that's one of the big challenges. And the biggest challenge you've just addressed, which is the just transition. Every crisis has a Darwinistic nature. Every crisis results in a bigger difference between poor and rich. Every crisis tends to complement the wealth into the hands of fewer people, the people that were better off before going into the crisis. So we already had a huge challenge in shaping this transition, the green transition, into a just way, and that challenge has only grown. And we need to be up for that, and we need to be very vigilant on that, because as we've said before, this transition will be just, or it will not happen. It will be stopped. We are a democracy, luckily, and we should keep it, we should preserve it, and that democracy will tell us when we're going into the wrong direction. And sometimes it did. The yellow vests are one example of that, and an example that President Macron seemed to have learned from, and other governments did so too, by the way. But now we have an even bigger challenge than that. And I already mentioned the biggest challenge, but there's one, well, obliterating them all, which is the international one. And we have only started to see the effects of corona, because that's very hard to predict. Obviously, the knee-jerk reaction was to close borders and keep everything for yourself. The second reaction is obviously a realization that your value chains are pretty fragile, and you can better get in touch with the countries that are providing part of your food and part of your products, and get a good relationship with them. So the knee-jerk reaction is one of nationalism. The second reaction might be one of more internationalism. And let's see where the balance between the two ends up. And obviously, as a politician, we are motivated to work on the second one and prevent the knee-jerk reaction. And the Commission already attempted, with, well, let's say some success, to stop the first knee-jerk reactions, also by member states, to close all their borders, etc. So that was the first weeks of the corona crisis were really ugly in terms of returning back to your national borders and returning back to your national environment, instead of learning that sharing your business and sharing your gowns and your masks and your ventilators will make Europe stronger. Well, it took us a while, a few weeks, but now we have realized that, and I do think that's an example that we will see much more also on a global scale. The knee-jerk reaction is first, but then we have to work on a more international approach, which will make us all stronger in the end, and we know it.
Indeed, and I think the corona crisis certainly also provides enormous lessons for addressing the climate crisis, and just reminds of the importance of solidarity and cooperation in times like this. And as we know that the climate and the wider sustainability crisis are looming out there, it is essential that we get the partnerships and the global cooperation ongoing at this stage, so that we are prepared to also address the climate crisis stronger together. So I think very important points there. We are running out of time. Thank you so much, Mr. Samsom, joining us today. I think the discussion has certainly showcased the importance of green recovery and getting this right. At the same time, the challenge obviously is enormous. We've touched upon a number of the elements, and I think we're all going to go and check the economic figures and what the state of play is. But it is clearly, and the challenge is enormous. But at the same time, if we do get this right, if we push our public and private money where it is needed, we can actually hope to ensure a more rapid recovery from this crisis, and then also emerge more prepared to actually address what is even bigger crisis that is looming, and the problems that are waiting for us, and that are in the nature of the climate and sustainability crisis. So it should be in the interest of the EU, our member states, and our authorities, our business, to actually use this moment to come out stronger and with solutions, with skills to actually respond to our sustainability crisis. So all the best in that effort. We obviously very much look forward to having further exchanges with you as we try to recover from the crisis. But thank you very much for joining us, and thank you also for all our participants for your questions and for your input, and we look forward to further discussions, and wishing you all a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.